Welcome, everyone. And it's my honor, our honor, to have with us today two distinguished members, retired, of the United States Armed Services. General Martin Dempsey, who's happily right now, happy for us, hopefully happily for him as well, is serving as a Rubenstein Fellow here at Duke University and has had a lot of opportunity to engage with students at both the public policy school, the business school, and elsewhere, talking about his long experience in issues of leadership and management. Most of you probably know that General Dempsey had served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 2011 to 2015, brings decades of experience in the military to bear on his perspective, and we're very honored and delighted to have you here, General Dempsey. Thank you for joining us. We also have with us General Charles Dunlap. I should say General Dempsey comes out of the Army. General Dunlap comes out of the Air Force. I don't know whether that will raise any interesting issues of discussion for us. Perhaps they will, and I encourage you all to vent whatever historic frustrations you might have had, and we'll enjoy witnessing them. General Dunlap, Charlie Dunlap, to all of us, is now a longstanding member of the Duke Law School. He teaches courses on national security and related issues. He was the second person in the Judge Advocate General's Corps when he was a general in the Air Force, and we're delighted to have him here as well. Between these two gentlemen, they bring more than 7 decades of experience in the United States military, and we're really looking forward to them sharing their views on the corona crisis and what its impact has been on the military. So thank you both for being here. By way of introduction, let me just say very briefly that while there seems to have been a considerable amount of press and public attention to one particular personnel matter on one particular Navy vessel, an aircraft carrier, and some attention to the disease burden within that community, there's been very little attention paid to how the coronavirus is impacting our military from a readiness standpoint, from a personnel standpoint, and we're all looking forward to you bringing much more information to bear on those important issues. So let me start, if I can, with both of you, and answer in whatever order you prefer. Is how has the coronavirus impacted on the readiness of the United States military to respond to a crisis?
Charlie, you want to go first?
Sir, you're the senior. I'll
age before beauty.
Well, I'll kick off the conversation simply by saying that I think that at this moment, the U.S. military has been able to maintain the necessary readiness. Obviously, as time goes on, that's going to become more difficult. The nature of readiness in the military, I think, especially for certain kinds of formations, ground formations, and so forth, things like social distancing will be very difficult to maintain, and at some point, training is going to be a challenge. And I think that military authorities are working very hard as to how that's going to be. But at the moment, I think the readiness has been remarkably maintained, but it certainly is a concern for everybody as we look at the months and years ahead. Sir?
Yeah, what I would add is the perpetual question of ready for what? Because as I used to go up on Capitol Hill and try to describe readiness, it's hard to do because it's abstract, and it has to do with national priorities, which from time to time change. It has to do with budget support. It has to do with myriad factors. What I'll tell you right now is a couple of things. One is this is an unprecedented crisis in every sense of the word. I mean, nothing like anything I experienced in my 41 years. And it's also the first crisis that we've been working through in, let's call it, the social media age, which has the effect of making things a little more complex. It speeds things up. It puts leaders under intense scrutiny, which affects decision making. And so on one hand, we've got a lot of experience in dealing with crises, but this one is different. And so I think we need to just concede that it's different. The second thing is that there's really three things the military is trying to do right now. One is the things it was doing before the crisis, which is to say deterring our enemies, encouraging our allies, maintaining a forward presence, maintaining, if you're in the Navy, maintaining freedom of navigation, for the movement of goods and services and resources. So we're still trying to do that. Second thing is what we call, the mission is direct support to civil authority, which is all the things you see the military doing in support of federal government, local officials, with, and in some cases separately from, the National Guard and Reserve. That's called DSCA, and it has consumed a certain portion of the force. And the last thing is, I think it's worth remembering that, the 1.2 million men in uniform and their families, and then if you add in the Guard and Reserve, it's up around 2 million and their families. We're also worried, as they are, that we take care of them as American citizens themselves. So it's really about balancing those three separate but clearly very much related missions.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with General Dempsey on that. And I think that what we'll see more of, and General Goldfein, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, has focused on 4 missions that he's knows he can't take a buy on during this period. It's the nuclear mission, it's the cyber mission, it's ongoing combat operations, and also he put in there standing up the Space Force. There are the core functions, and in some areas, for example, the nuclear deterrence, they changed some of the procedures that they use for the troops in the silos, the missile launch officers, where they would initially just go down there for 3 or 4 days. Now they've extended that up to 2 weeks so that there's less of a chance of infection, and they're also sequestering, so to speak, certain groups so that there would not be a transmission. But remarkably, the military has done fairly well. I think the latest numbers that I've seen were about 3,000 of that 2 to 2.3 million people in the armed forces have been infected, and the vast majority of them have only suffered mild illnesses. So what the military has done so far has been pretty good. General Dempsey made an important point about the participation of the Guard and the reserves. I think that there are over close to 30,000 guardsmen who have been called to active duty or called to duty by the governors in what's called Title 22 status, where the federal government pays the bill, but they're actually under the command of the local government. And historically, that has been one of the functions and rationales for the National Guard, to provide governors with that kind of ready, disciplined, trained force for all kinds of emergencies. Of course, this is something new. But I'm thinking of the long term, and I do have some concerns about maintaining readiness over the long term, beginning with recruiting. General Dempsey also made the important point that we live in the era of social media, and right now, the reports that I've seen about recruiting, it's difficult. The recruiters are doubling down on their social media presence and trying to contact potential recruits in that way. But as one observer put it, it's people can hang up on social media or not respond, whereas that person-to-person interaction often is the most effective way of bringing a young person into the armed forces. And the way the armed forces is structured, you need this constant flow of people into the armed forces because you have a constant flow going out. And if that becomes disrupted, that could be a challenge.
General Dempsey, can I return to a comment that you made about this is a crisis that's different than any we've ever experienced before? If you read the various accounts, various authorities had gamed through the possibilities of a pandemic, perhaps not precisely the way they have occurred. Were there things that we could have done based upon those various projected scenarios to make ourselves better prepared? And are there things that we're learning now that we need to employ and implement in order to make ourselves better prepared the next time this happens?
Well, let me start with your last question, which is, are there things we should be doing now to look over the horizon? I mean, the conversations I've had inside the military and out, I've always tried to make the point that in a crisis, you triage what you can with the immediate crisis, but you always try to find ways to have some group of people thinking about how to take advantage of the crisis. And in this case, I think, first of all, it's clear to me, or as clear as it can be to a man that studied English literature and not science, that we're in a cycle where the time between pandemics seems to be shortening. And so I think, somebody ought, instead of looking at how do we want to look in 2040, it feels to me like we want to take a look at what we want to look like in 2025. And that group of people taking on that task ought to learn from what's happening now, and then in a very, let's call it nonpartisan way, decide how the nation needs to posture itself. I do a little work with professional sports, and I can tell you that there's a great deal of conversation going on, not only about how, when, and if we reopen for this season, but also what do we want to look like in 2025? Because again, this is not the last time we'll see this. When I said, by the way, that it was unprecedented, I think in two ways. One was I mentioned the social media aspect of it, which generates fear. I mean, let's face it, the real issue in dealing with a pandemic, especially an airborne pandemic, is that it generates fear. And so, what we really need to be in the business of doing, not just addressing this thing from a medical perspective, a public health perspective, but also dealing with that element of fear, which we're going to see play out as we decide when and if and how we quote unquote reopen. The other thing is, look, let's be honest, we started this crisis on we're building on a foundation that was pretty shaky to begin with in terms of the way we interact with each other in this country politically, meaning, without passing judgments about, which party had it right and which party had it wrong, we have to admit to ourselves that we started into this crisis at a time when it felt that we were about as divided as we've appeared to be, maybe I think since the 1960s or so. Someone could challenge me on that and I'd probably back away. But the point is, we started from a bit of a shaky platform, and we're trying to both, repair the platform while we're trying to deal with the pandemic, and that makes it really difficult. And fortunately, I think the military's been pretty steady through it all, and I hope that continues.
Are there, just to follow up on the first comment you made, are there some lessons that you've extracted that we clearly need to implement to make things more efficient and more effective the next time this happens?
Are you addressing that to me, Buzz?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I was involved in the 2014 Ebola response, and in the narrow frame of what could the military do in support of not just domestic civil authority, but international organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières and others. And we did some things, and we did, as we always do, exhaustive after action reviews. And about that time I left the job. And so I don't know what policies or structures were put in place, but here's what if I were still in the business of advising, what I'd say is, the structures and the stockpiles and the processes are important, but what's really important in dealing with a global issue is relationships. And so when I can tell you that when I left, our military had a very close relationship with the Center for Disease Control, the Department of Health and Human Services, the National Institute of Health, the World Health Organization, Médecins Sans Frontières. I could tick them all off, but we had liaisons that were put in place, again, to have a relationship so that the foundation of any future problem would be built on pre-existing relationships. Forget about processes, pre-existing relationships. And I think that's an important lesson that we need to have looking ahead to 2025.
Got it. Charlie, Jonathan, let me switch back to you and get back to the readiness point and the degradation of that you talked about. From a civilian standpoint, I never served in the military, but it strikes me one of the key elements of being ready as a military is you need large numbers of people in close proximity to one another for extended periods of time, and both in terms of training and deployment and once they're deployed. How is that compatible with the restrictions that are necessary to combat the coronavirus? And aren't we just endangering our troops by having them perform their normal functions, which is to be in close proximity to one another?
Well, to a certain extent, you can't avoid that close proximity. At some point in the training cycle, that's going to be necessary. But I do think that there are some mitigating factors that will be taken into account. One is there are opportunities for social distancing. There are opportunities for wearing masks. And you're talking about a population generally that is in the least vulnerable category. Young, healthy individuals without pre-existing conditions. And one of the challenges I think the military has right now is that probably a lot of the troops are asymptomatic. And so testing of them will be really important. But in terms of readiness, we obviously need to think about the troops, but we also need to think about the equipment. One of the things that has really been highlighted by this crisis is the importance of the supply chain. And even with respect to defense manufacturing, defense contractors, and even with things like the Buy America Act, we're finding that there are vulnerabilities in that supply chain. So I think we'll see differences in that in the future. And just from my perspective, and speaking only for me, I think that this is really going to accelerate manufacturing, like 3D printing. We're already seeing that done in the Air Force and the Navy, and I'm sure in the Army as well. We're going to see manufacturers, I think, doubling their efforts on that and things like robotic factories and so forth. And in the military realm, I think that this experience will give impetus to the whole idea of autonomous weapon systems. In other words, being able to conduct operations without requiring a great deal of putting a great deal of troops in jeopardy, not just from the enemy, but perhaps from some kind of biological challenge. And I do think adversaries are going to look at this process. They are going to see the disruption that this virus has caused us, and they're going to look to see how they can capitalize on it. And something that General Dempsey mentioned is really important. We're going to see adversaries trying to create the fear that will enable them to advance their nefarious purposes. And it may be with a phony virus, with sending suicide virus people into our midst, or things we can't imagine, but we need to be thinking hard about those kinds of challenges, I would suggest.
You raised the issue of autonomous weapon systems, and I know you've talked about that at some of our programs in the past, and we will in the future. But thinking about this as a strong impetus for further development, that is I think a very important observation. You mentioned also the need for testing to really understand the disease incidence within the military personnel. Has the military and the military hospitals have the same kind of shortages of testing available, of PPE available, of ventilators available? Has that been a problem that's paralleled the civilian health establishment, or is the military experiencing a different situation here?
I can't give you chapter and verse on that because I'm really not sure. My sense, though, is that the military is in naturally in better shape for that kind of contingency than maybe some civilian hospitals are, because it's been a long-standing aspect of military readiness to be prepared in what we call nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare environments. So in that sense, there's been training, there's been an accumulation of some equipment. And so I think the military is in better shape in that respect. But as you point out, trying to really understand the contours of this particular virus will be challenging, because young people, may not show the symptoms as maybe other groups are. So I think that it will be necessary for the military to do a great deal of testing. And in addition, we're hearing that there is the possibility that once someone asymptomatic has had the illness, they might carry some kind of immunity. And I think the military needs to identify those who have that marker, because that'll be valuable information as well in figuring out what the way ahead in the quote unquote new normal will be.
General Dempsey, do you want to weigh in on this issue?
Well, just to agree with Charlie, we're making adaptations as we go. I mean, for example, basic training, when we talked about recruiting earlier, basic training, normally a 10-week experience. So now the adaptation is the first 2 weeks, the new recruits are put into a quarantine environment with a bubble around them, given that we don't have as many tests. I mean, we're in the same position as everyone else. I mean, testing is still in short supply, and of course there's some tests that are more reliable than others, apparently. I'm just reading about this. I don't have any personal experience with it. So we take new recruits, we put them in quarantine for a 14-day period, and in so doing, hopefully run the course of those who may be carrying it upon entry. And then we begin our normal course of training. And the recruits are really very much under control for that remaining 8 weeks of training. So we have good confidence that the recruits, when we ship them off to their first units, are coronavirus free. Now, the problem, of course, is when I came in the military, probably Charlie do, I mean, we were a conscript army. I'm talking Army now, but it was all the services. Mm-hmm. And about 20% of the Army was married. The other 80% was single. And you could put them into we put them into barracks, which down the road became called dormitories, same thing, different name. But the point is we had them very much under control. Now, of course, the Army's probably 70 to 75% married and 25% single. And at the end of the day, they go home to their families and they're in the local economy and living, just like you are. And so we've got a different challenge with a volunteer Army, and in particular, those who are post basic training than we do with the basic trainees themselves.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point, that we now have on our bases and elsewhere, the families, and obviously the military members are very concerned about them. One of the things that I see the military doing now that might alleviate some of the concern, because right now there's a stop movement order, meaning the troops can't plan to go on to their new base. And this can be very disruptive for families because spouses need to find jobs, kids need to register for school, and so forth. And so one of the things that I think Secretary Esper is considering is right now voluntary tour extensions, which will allow people to stay in place longer and retain some of that experience and readiness that they already have, as opposed to the disruption that any PCS might cause. And I think that we might see more of this in the future because as it's often said, you recruit the individual, but you retain the family. So concern about the families, I think, is going to be very much on the mind of senior military leaders.
Let's talk a bit about impact on families. What are you seeing in terms of impact on families and the impact on the children within these families? I know the Army has a big commitment that all of its personnel need to be ready to deploy. And one aspect of that is making sure they're comfortable about their situation of their families. How has this all impacted the military families?
Well, honestly, Buzz, I think of all of the different demographics in our country, the group that is generally most ready for uncertainty is the military family, because especially since 2001, we've had the military on a fairly aggressive, not fairly aggressive, a very aggressive cycle of deployments, redeployments, train up for deployment, and then repeat. And so family members get to be, spouses and children get to be pretty self-reliant in that environment. In fact, ironically, I think, my son's still in the military, and he's home more now than he's been home with his family. He goes in, he's the executive officer to a 2-star general, but he's home more than he's gone now, and he's not waiting on a deployment. And so, it's ironically, the military members are home more now than they've probably been home in the last 19 years. What does that all mean? I don't know. I mean, at some point, we've got to get back to that pattern, because, you know what they say about the military. It's like saying about a ship. A ship is safer in a harbor, but that's not why we build them. And so we've got to get the military back on a normal footing, a normal cycle. And that's what Secretary Esper and the service chiefs and the chairman and the Joint Chiefs are trying to figure out, is how to do that in a responsible way, given the risk to the family members and soldiers and sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guards.
I think we're all finding ourselves. I think we're all finding ourselves spending more time with our spouses than we have in a very long time, and we're all adjusting to that phenomenon, I think.
I completely agree with General Dempsey that as a group, it's hard to think of another demographic that would be more resilient than the military family, for all the reasons he mentioned. At the same time, military families are undergoing much of the same thing that others are, and maybe in certain respects are suffering more, in that, for example, some military families have come to depend upon the 2 incomes, the income from the non-military spouse, and in many instances they've lost that. They expect, in terms of childcare, for example, that the children will be in school, and a lot of the children aren't in school, the majority of them. I think within military families, we already have a strong homeschooling idea, and I think this will serve to strengthen that even more. But looking long term, will it make the military become even more insular and raise all the issues that some people have expressed concern about the military becoming more isolated from the society it serves? It's hard to say, but I do think that as we learn to adjust to this, I think that we're going to see more remote working and so forth, that there are social issues affecting the military as well as our larger society that we've only begun to grapple with.
Well, there's been a talk for a number of years about a mental health crisis among our military service personnel and their families, as well as the veterans. Is there a great concern that this is going to exacerbate those problems, and are there any efforts being currently contemplated to address that?
Well, I want to defer to
General
Dempsey.
The issue of mental health, and in particular the worst possible outcome of mental health issues, which is of course suicide, has frankly been at the top of our list of issues we've been trying to solve for 10 years, probably, maybe even a few more than that. And we've made very little progress. I mean, we've made some progress, but not nearly what we'd want. And that kind of mirrors the larger issues of society with addictions and things like suicide. Is this going to exacerbate it? I don't know. The statistics are a bit blurred right now. As you know, there's been some suicide issues at Duke University during this period. There's been suicide issues at a couple of the service academies, and it's unclear whether those were related in any way to the fear generated by something like a pandemic, or the isolation, the lack of social interaction. I work with a group called TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program Survivors, and we have a hotline for issues like this, and it's very active right now. And so my instinct is that we're only going to know when we have the data that we're accumulating right now. And I think it's probably, as the saying goes, we're at the end of the beginning, but we have to learn a whole bunch more here in the near term. My instinct is it probably will exacerbate it somewhat, but I don't know how to quantify that. Charlie, do you have any other thought?
I don't have too much to add to that, except to say that veterans organizations have already raised the concern that veterans with pre-existing mental conditions, it'll be exacerbated rather by the social isolation that the quarantines and so forth can generate. I think we'll have to see the numbers, and it'll be interesting to see how they parallel to civilian society. It could be, and I want to be hopeful, that this will be an opportunity to really zero in on the true problems. I'm not, in terms of the VA especially, I'm not one of the people who complains about the VA all the time. My personal experience, especially here in Durham, I think the VA is very good. And I did take a look at their sites and their mental health options, and they have a rather robust outreach. It's not going to be perfect, and it's going to be, different in different areas, but I think that they're doing what they can. I think somewhat like what General Dempsey has mentioned, we're going to learn a lot about mental health and the effects of social distancing, social isolation, just in general, and the military will be part of that. I do think, optimistically, things like what we're doing right now, I mean, honestly, I never heard of Zoom, 6 weeks ago. This is a different opportunity for people to stay in touch with each other. I think it's different from other social media, and we'll just see an enhancement of this ability to communicate remotely. And optimistically, I hope that has some positive effect on mental health for those in the armed forces and elsewhere.
Well, I think we're all looking at severe budget cuts across the board in every sector, and looking at the amounts of money that Congress is appropriating for short-term use to address the COVID crisis. There are clearly going to be budget cuts in the future, and probably a lot of pressure on the military. How do you assure that the kinds of programs that you're talking about, mental health for veterans, mental health within the VA, support for the families, won't get triaged out when we begin to parse what's necessary in the military budget?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say, I thought Zoom was what attracted people to join the Air Force. That's the only. Now I know it's something else.
I knew we'd get there eventually. Continue.
Yeah, hit the afterburner. But what I would say about, I'm going to answer your question, but I will tell you that. But worrying about the budget in the middle of a crisis of this magnitude is, as I've heard it described, about like getting in the ring with Mike Tyson and worrying about whether you have chapstick. I mean, it's just, it's just one of those times where I think as a nation, we've got to find the resources we need, as do individual organizations like the military, and apply them. Now, that said, we, the military, even when I was still the chairman, we were looking and having no idea what would happen in 2016. We were looking at a post-2020 fiscal environment that would be austere. And there's a whole bunch of economic reasons that I wouldn't even think to bore you with, but we thought that beyond 2020, we were going to have some budget problems one way or the other. So with the Trump administration, there's been a good bump in military spending or military resources, fiscal resources for the military. But we're still looking at a post-2020 environment, which would be a downturn. Here's what I'll tell you about the budget in general with the military. What we really need from the Congress of the United States is a predictable budget. Wild swings in the budget are really hard to manage, even when they work to your benefit. The second thing is we need flexibility. We've still got infrastructure we don't need. We've still got weapon systems we don't need. People argue whether that's 15% of the budget or 20% of the budget. So where I'm heading with this is we are very clear-eyed about the fact that there's going to be a negative turn in our budget. And what we're trying to do is get the predictability and the flexibility to be able to manage that downturn. This will have made it a little more difficult, I think, but I don't think anyone sees this as a sea change in what we anticipate in our budget post 2020.
I agree with much of what General Dempsey has said. Even if we have to look at it perhaps in macroeconomic terms. Even if the military would continue to get like 3.2% of the GDP, that GDP is going to be smaller. So it's inevitable that the budget is going to be smaller. I would anticipate I would not worry so much about money for mental health care for veterans and things like that. I would worry about budget money for advanced weapon systems to confront peer and near peer competitors like China and Russia. Because I think people are going to be very willing to build up capability in medical and stockpiles and so forth. The things that people and governors, especially with respect to the Guard, see that they really like about the military, but they aren't, in other words, the defense support capability, the engineering, the medical, the security forces, the communications gear, which is all important, but it's not everything when you have to confront peer and near peer competitors. And we ought not just think about our own budgets. One of the things General Dempsey said, and I completely agree with them, is that in the military, especially on a global scale, partnerships matter, allies matter. And I think our allies are being devastated. And I think that their military budgets, we're not going to see that hoped for 2% increase across the board in NATO. That money is being spent right now, as it should be. But as we look at our security environment in the future, that money's not going to be there. In addition, in those countries, I think that they will also see their militaries as valued domestic actors in situations like this. So they too will, I think, turn away from the focus on the high-end weaponry, which is necessary to confront an existential threat, in favor of things that might help them in the next pandemic. I think it's going to be a very complicated environment. And I hope that General Dempsey is right, that at least for the US, we're given the opportunity to shape the military that we need for the future and for example, help us to shed unwanted and unneeded bases and infrastructure and even some weapon systems in favor of those that really preserve our core capability.
General Dempsey, General Dunlap, I want to throw the questioning open to the participants, but any further thoughts you want to share before we do that?
No, I'd be actually eager to hear what's on their mind.
Me too.
Right. Tim, you're on.
Oh, wonderful. Generals, thank you. So one of the questions we've got multiple times, and I've heard multiple times, is what role the military is playing here at home in what role they are playing and can be playing or will be playing in mitigating the effects. One person in the chat asked if they would be used to enforce social distancing. So a sort of, I'm assuming they're asking about law enforcement. And then another question was about disease research. What research is the military doing alongside of normal public research and in addition to it?
Hey, Charlie, I think you are better positioned to answer the question about Posse Comitatus than I am.
Yeah, well, you're fully qualified, sir, but allow me to say that Posse Comitatus Act, which General Dempsey referenced, is actually a federal statute which prohibits the active duty military from enforcing the law. So under current law, that won't be permitted absent certain declarations and activations of authorities under what we call the Insurrection Act. However, the National Guard, when it's not federalized, as the vast majority are right now, can enforce the law depending upon what their particular state law authorizes. Here's my concern. the military depends upon the fact that it's the most trusted institution in American society to be the kind of entity that young people want to join. We have a hard enough time recruiting young people into the military, partly because around 70 to 75% of them can't qualify anyway. And now we have COVID-19, inhibiting that. So if people see people in uniforms, they may not be able to distinguish between the active duty military in a federal capacity and National Guardsmen in a state capacity, even though legally speaking, they're very different. So I would hope that that would be the last thing, and only in a unbelievably catastrophic circumstance would the military be asked to do that. But I will note that one issue that came up during Katrina was that the civilian police, I think 250 New Orleans policemen walked off the job. In the military, nobody walks off the job. They're not allowed to. And in fact, the military law prohibits that. And so if we got in a situation, which I don't foresee, where we had significant numbers of security personnel walking off the job, then we might have to call upon the military. But I would really hate to see that circumstance. That's a no-win proposition as far as I'm concerned. In terms of research, I think there's already much collaboration between the military research labs at Fort Detrick, I think it is, correct me if I'm wrong on that, General Dempsey, where we study biological threats all the time. I think you'll see a lot of DoD and DARPA grants going out to universities to do the same thing, because the military is thinking, as I mentioned before, that adversaries are going to see this and they're going to try to replicate the damage that's been done to our economy and the fear and so forth. That's the nature of terrorism.
Yeah, I agree. It would be a sad day in this country if the military was put into a position to have to be part of law enforcement on its own citizens. And I can assure you the partnerships that have been forged with medical research, both at the university level and in private industry and in the public, are alive and well and in high gear.
And let's face it, local police are better suited, better equipped to do those kinds of things than the military is in general. You know, the way the military looks at threats, it looks to eliminate threats in a way that is totally unsuitable in a civilian setting. So we have over 800,000 sworn police officers in this country, and they are the ones best suited and best trained for that particular task.
Mr. Chairman, after stepping down, you took on a new chairmanship, and now you are leading USA Basketball. It's sort of an odd time to be doing that. How are things over there? How are things going for you with that?
It's an odd time to be doing it. I mean, USA Basketball is all of our, it is youth development, but it's also preparing teams to compete in international competition from age 14. We have under 14s, under 16s, 18s, 19s, and then the Olympic team, men and women, 3-on-3, 5-on-5. Well, all of those competitions are suspended, postponed, and in some cases canceled. And it's unclear. I mean, FIBA and the Olympic movement, the National Basketball Association, and us, USA Basketball, we're all struggling with the same question, and that is, how do we move from flattening the curve to some restoration of what I suppose we could call normalcy, and then eventually, what do we look like between this pandemic and the next one? And I suppose the positive news is that we're all collaborating on answering those questions. There's no one organization kind of going its own way. But it's a lot more, I thought I was getting this cushy job that will allow me to go to the Olympics and sit in the front row and at center court, and now I'm, talking about things like how do we pick a team and get it ready to go to Tokyo in 2021. So.
Yeah. And let's not think of things like USA basketball as simply nice to do entertainment or whatever. That builds the infrastructure in this country in a real way, sports does writ large, of a healthy youth. It teaches youth values. It teaches youth self-initiative and all the things that we will want and need in tomorrow's military. So the idea that these things can just be put aside forever, I think is underestimating the national security implications of it. Not to mention the ability of young people to learn to get together, to work as a team. These are all things we do in the military. And so I think it's important that, and I'm thrilled that General Dempsey's taken on this, and I hope others do, of figuring out how we can make this happen, because this isn't just, not being able to watch your favorite team on TV. It has broader national security and societal implications.
For a number of years, actually, General Dempsey and his wife have sat behind me at Duke basketball games. I don't know if you remember me, General Dempsey, but he has sat behind me. So I have cheered along with him at some of the most exciting moments. So I know your love of basketball, and hopefully we can get back in there sometime soon.
Yeah, and as a way of keeping our kind of our skill set alive, my wife goes around yelling at me like she does at referees, and so we'll be ready. We'll be ready whenever we get back into action.
There we go. That's what I like to hear. I'm gonna finish out with, I think, the question that came up a lot, and a really important one, is about both service people in the military right now and early in their careers, and service people looking to join the service. What advice can you give? How can, I guess they're looking for guidance from their former commanding officers on what the way forward for them looks like. Is now the right time to join, and what that's going to look like for them in the post-corona era?
Well, I'll let General Dempsey close it out by just having a few initial comments. Number one, I think, sir, you have a couple of books out. Maybe you should mention that, because these are the kinds of things that young people ought to do, because it's more about just military service. It's about public service, and I think that's what they ought to be thinking about. What I would tell them is, look, life is challenging. You're being confronted with a challenge. You will decide the kind of person you are going to be by how you respond to this challenge. And, public service, uniformed or non-uniformed, is not easy. There are risks. And particularly in the military, you're putting yourself out there to do something that only 1% of the population or whatever does. It's not a risk-free endeavor, and it's never going to be. But I will say this: I would encourage young people to have their adventure when they're young. You don't want to be, I'll be, 70 years old here soon, but you don't want to look back in your life at, an advanced age and think, well, I'm going to have my adventure now. You have to have that adventure when you're young. And if you can coordinate that thirst for adventure with public service, you're going to be able to look yourself in the mirror, years from now or decades from now, and be happy with what you see.
Yeah, well said, Charlie. What I always tell young folks about whether or not they should serve is that there's no stronger instinct in humanity than the desire to belong. That's especially true, by the way, when you're fearful. There is only one antidote to fear, and it's belonging. And one of the things that the military does, I try not to be too prideful about the military, but in this point I will be, and that is that very few organizations I've ever encountered establish that sense of belonging better than the military. Secondly, we build leaders. And, Charlie very kindly mentioned that I wrote a book. I wrote a couple of books. The one that's coming out in May is called No Time for Spectators. And I wrote it 18 months, I started writing it 18 months ago, finished in December, before all of this started to happen, because it was my instinct that, again, in the age of social media, there's an instinct to kind of stay on the sidelines, which is a very bad instinct. And now it's pretty clear that we need everybody. To solve this problem, we actually need everybody to be participating. So, and one of the things, to link it to the point about the military, one of the things we do is, in the military, is we get everybody in the fight. The most junior member of the squad or of the wing or of the fleet is just as important, maybe even more important, than the most senior member of the squad or the wing or the fleet. And so it's like Greg Popovich, to link it to basketball, has a saying, he wants everybody in the huddle. Because as you've seen in pro sports sometimes, you'll have the 5 players that are in the game, they're kind of focused. Everybody else is watching the mascot or the cheerleaders or the Jumbotron. And Pop doesn't put up with that. When he calls a timeout, Mike's the same way, Mike Krzyzewski. When they call a timeout, they expect 12 or 15 players to be in the huddle. And that's what we need. And that's what the military does. We don't let people drift away. We make sure they stay focused on the team and on the mission. And we're going to be, we'll have our challenges getting through this, because generally our challenges are the same as society's challenges. But I happen to think we'll come out of it stronger when we finally do come out of it.
Well,
Thank you very much. Buzz, did you want to close this out?
Yeah, let me say, General Dempsey, General Dunlap, we're delighted that you're here with us at Duke, even if virtually most of the time right now. But I must say, as I listen to the wisdom and perspective that you both bring to the table here, I'm sorry you're at Duke, and I wish you were still in the government, contributing to a better approach to the problems we're confronting. So thank you both kindly for taking the time to do this. I think it brings a window not only to the world of how this corona crisis is impacting our military population, but I think equally as important, how people who come out of the military are thinking about these problems and the kind of respect we have to have and must have for all the folks that are doing it. So we're grateful for all that you've done.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I think I speak for General Dempsey as well. We're thrilled to have this opportunity. And wow, what a great organization you have here, and the great project you're doing. Kudos.
Thank you. General Dunlap, General Dempsey, thank you both kindly. And we will call upon you both again. I think we'll do a program on sports and probably one on automated weaponry, and we'll need your services again. Thank you both kindly. Stay safe.
Sounds great.
Stay
Thank
safe.
you.
See you, Charlie.
See you, sir.